Does struggling with your faith and any doubts you may have displease God? Well, let's find out. Hey everyone, I'm Colin, the resident nerd and Bible scholar here at the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We have an ongoing series where we talk about the ridiculous things some Christians say and what we should say instead. This is an unfortunate one that a lot of people hear in church, maybe not in those exact words, but the message comes across that God is displeased with you if you have any doubts. And as I was looking into this, I was really only able to find one passage of scripture that I think this belief may be based in. And it's Hebrews 11. This is right in the middle of the famous Hall of Faith passage that talks about people from the Old Testament, from the Tanakh, and stories of their faith. It's kind of an ironic passage if you actually go back and read the lives of some of those people. They don't exactly seem like faith-filled people, but that's another matter for another day. The verse in question is verse 6 of Hebrews 11. But without faith, it is impossible to please him, meaning God. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Now, I can kind of understand how, at first blush, this verse might sound like it's saying, if you don't have absolute faith, you are displeasing to God. I mean, without faith, it is impossible to please him. But the more I've looked at this verse, the more I've realized that it's actually one of the most complicated and even paradoxical verses in all of Scripture. Let me give you a little bit of a quick, rough translation that I put together for this verse. Now, it is impossible to make peace with God without belief. This is because it is necessary for the one who approaches God to believe that he exists and that he becomes the employer of those who demand an account from him. You might notice that's very different from the way a lot of translations render the verse, and there's reasons for that I want to get into in this video. See, the definition that I learned for faith when I was in Bible college is believing loyalty. It's less intellectual and more of a choice you make to align yourself with a particular person who has more power and resources than you. It's based in the ancient Near Eastern idea of a suzerain vassal treaty, where you have someone with more power and resources who helps you out in a mutually beneficial contract. And then you choose to be loyal to that person because of what they can provide you. So that's kind of the idea of faith, is that you are choosing to align yourself with God for mutually beneficial purposes. He protects, rewards, guides you, depending on the passage of scripture, it might be a little different, and you provide him your fealty, your loyalty. Well, that kind of works in this passage, but it might not entirely fit in the way that you think it would. More on that in a second. First, I want to look at the meaning of this word that's translated pleasing God. Originally, the word actually had a base meaning of making peace with God, and I like that better for this particular instance. Since the word is found only in Hebrews, at least within the New Testament, it's used twice in this chapter and once at the end of the book to say that burnt offerings of praise please God. So perhaps then, faith in God isn't much more than just thankfulness to something greater than you for what you couldn't do or provide on your own. All right, that gets us kind of through the first part of the verse. But if we look at the second, this is a little weird. He who comes to God must believe that he is. If you stop and think about it, that's kind of just a truism. If you're interacting with God, you are presuming his existence. And as we move into the last part of the verse, he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. What the King James translates as rewarder, that's not bad translation, but the word behind it has the idea of someone who employs a mercenary. It's actually related to the word mistheos for anyone who has played Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And that really fascinates me because mercenaries, mistheos, they are loyal only to whoever is paying them at the moment. So if faith is all about believing loyalty, bringing it back to the start of the verse, then it seems odd to use that word to refer to God here when maybe master would make a lot more sense. Because it's using this word of somebody who is an employer of basically a bounty hunter, a mercenary, to describe God. But if this whole thing is about faith, it's about believing loyalty, well, mercenaries don't have that. And so using this word to describe God doesn't seem to fit with that standard idea of faith. So maybe our idea of what faith looks like needs to change a little bit. Hang on to that thought for a second. What most translations have as some variation of seek after him, it can mean that, but it has a little bit more oomph behind it than just that. It really has the idea of challenging someone or calling them to account for something. And while I love the idea that God rewards people who are willing to challenge him, I mean, consider Jacob with the angel in Genesis, Job in the entire book of Job, or even the Syrophoenician woman with Jesus, that flies in the face of what we normally think of as faith or believing loyalty. So I would argue that this verse means that we need to reconsider what a healthy faith looks like and what pleasing God looks like. Here's how I'm currently sitting with it. And, if you ask me again in a few months, my thoughts might be different then. But this is just where I'm at reading this verse right now. The first part should not ever be used to shame people who have doubts. It does not mean that doubts or questions make you displeasing to God. It means that when we're dealing with the supernatural, we are automatically in the realm of faith. None of it can be proved. So if you're interested in making peace with God or pleasing God, you have to realize that much of what you do is going to end up being subjective to your own interpretation of events as being a response from God or not. And the second part of the verse is a truism. It is a reminder to us that we are more imaginative and trusting beings than we often give ourselves credit for. So if you're talking to God, you believe that there's something bigger out there that is responding to you, or at least listening to you. Be that Yahweh, the universe, the force, whatever you might call it. And for all intents and purposes, you might as well call it God, because it's not something material around you. You're reaching out to something greater than yourself. That automatically makes you a believer of some kind. Now, maybe not in the way that many Christians use the word, but it does mean that you are believing in God. Whoever comes to God believes that he is. That's just the way it is. It's a truism. The third part is a comforting teaching. And this is where I think it all comes together. It's telling us that since our views on God are so subjective, we might as well take the most positive one that we can think of. If God is real, he is not afraid of your questions, your doubts, or even your challenges to him. Christianity started out as a Jewish sect, and Judaism traces its lineage back to a guy who literally, within the story, wrestled with God and was named after that event. God will not cast you out if you feel like you don't have the faith of these people in the Hall of Faith chapter. Again, go back and reread their stories, most of them in Genesis or throughout the Tanakh. These people screwed up time and time again and were often very unbelieving. God's not in the business of shaming people for not matching up to somebody else's life or expectations. He rewards those who are willing to stand up, even to him, when they don't like the injustice in the world around them, or perhaps even injustice that they perceive in their sacred scriptures. God is big enough to accept those wrestlings, those questions, those challenges, those doubts. And I would argue that the most faith-filled life you can live is the one that chooses to believe in a benevolent higher power who encourages critical thought and meaningful debate. So don't ever let someone tell you that your doubts, your questions, your concerns, your wrestlings make you displeasing to God. Now, you can point them right back to Hebrews 11:6 and tell them that their understanding of faith is what needs to change.